This is Report State, and today I need you to listen to something. I need you to listen to the sound a town makes when it dies. It is not dramatic. There is no explosion, no sirens, no final broadcast on the evening news. It is quieter than that. It is the sound of a parking lot with 2,000 spaces and 3 cars in it. It is the sound of a school bell ringing in a hallway where half the lockers are welded shut because there are not enough students to fill them. It is the hum of a streetlight buzzing over a road that nobody drives on anymore. That is the sound, and if you have ever driven through Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, or West Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon in February, you have heard it. You just did not know what it was. Now you will, because today, Report State is going to perform a full autopsy on the American Midwest. We are going to open up the Rust Belt, look inside, and show you exactly what went wrong, who did it, and why every single promise of recovery has been a lie. This is not a travel video. This is not a nostalgia trip. This is a crime scene investigation. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand why these 5 states will never, ever come back. But before we cut into the body, we need to understand what it was when it was alive. Because the Midwest was not always a graveyard. 70 years ago, it was the engine of the entire planet. I am not exaggerating. I am not using a metaphor. The industrial corridor stretching from Pittsburgh to Chicago was literally the manufacturing center of the world. Adjusted for inflation, was the equivalent of roughly $95,000 a year. For a man whose primary qualification was the ability to stand in front of a blast furnace for 8 hours without passing out. That was the American dream, and it was real. It was not a slogan on a poster. It was a paycheck. It was a pension. It was a union contract that said your employer could not fire you without cause and had to pay you a living wage. 17 million Americans worked in manufacturing in 1953. 17 million families with that kind of stability. Now let me give you the number that matters today. As of 2024, manufacturing employment in the United States is down to 12.4 million. That is a drop of nearly 5 million jobs from the peak. But that national number hides the real horror, because those jobs did not disappear evenly across the country. The Sun Belt gained some, the coasts kept some, but the Midwest, the place where most of those jobs existed, lost them almost entirely. In the state of Ohio alone, manufacturing employment dropped from over 1.4 million in 1969 to under 680,000 today. That is not a decline. That is an amputation. Half the industrial workforce of Ohio gone. And Ohio is not even the worst example. Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all of them have similar numbers. The factories did not just shrink, they vanished. And when the factories vanished, everything else went with them. I want to explain how this happened because most people think they know the story, but they only know the bumper sticker version. They think it was China. They think it was robots. They think it was inevitable. It was none of those things. The collapse of the Rust Belt was a series of decisions made by specific people at specific moments for specific reasons. And the single biggest decision, the one that cracked the foundation, had a name. It was called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1993, implemented January 1st, 1994. When NAFTA was being debated, the politicians who supported it made a specific promise. They said American manufacturing would benefit because US companies would gain access to Mexican and Canadian markets. They said the jobs that might move south would be low-skill, low-wage jobs that Americans did not want anyway. They said new, better jobs would replace them. Every single one of those promises was wrong. Here is what actually happened. Between 1994 and 2020, The United States lost an estimated 4.5 million manufacturing jobs that can be directly or indirectly linked to trade liberalization policies, including NAFTA and the subsequent entry of China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. The Economic Policy Institute tracked this. The Federal Reserve tracked this. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracked this. Everyone tracked this. The jobs moved to Mexico. They moved to China. They moved to Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia. And they did not come back. They are not coming back. The replacement jobs that were promised, the high-tech, high-skill, high-wage jobs, they materialized in San Francisco and Seattle and Austin and Raleigh. Not in Youngstown, not in Flint, not in Gary. The Midwest got the loss, the coasts got the replacement, and nobody in Washington seemed to notice or care about the difference. Now I want to take you to the crime scenes, one by one, and I am going to start with the worst one, the ground zero of American industrial collapse. Gary, Indiana. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and picture something. It is 1960. Gary, Indiana has a population of 178,000 people. It is a thriving, bustling, fully functioning American city. It has department stores and movie theaters and restaurants and parks. It has one of the best public school systems in the state. It has a downtown where families walk on Saturday afternoons. U.S. Steel's Gary Works is the largest integrated steel mill in the world. 25,000 people work there. 25,000. That single factory employs more people than the entire population of many American towns. The money flows, the taxes flow, the city works. Now open your eyes. It is 2024. The population of Gary, Indiana is 68,000. That is a loss of over 100,000 people. More than half the city is gone. But the people who left are not the story. The story is what they left behind. Drive through Gary today and you will see something that does not look like America. It looks like a war zone where the war ended 30 years ago and nobody came back to rebuild. Entire neighborhoods where every single house is abandoned. Not one or two houses on a block. Every house. Roofs caved in, walls collapsing, trees growing through living room floors. The Broadway Theater, which once seated 3,000 people for first-run movies, has been abandoned since 1997. The Methodist Church on Fifth Avenue, a gorgeous stone building that once held a congregation of 800, has a tree growing out of its bell tower. The public schools have been consolidated so many times that children ride buses for 45 minutes to reach a building that used to be 15 minutes away. Gary is not struggling. I want to be clear about that. Struggling implies that the city is fighting, that there is some kind of active resistance to the decline. Gary is not struggling. Gary is decomposing. The tax base collapsed when U.S. Steel cut its workforce from 25,000 to 5,000 over the course of 2 decades. When the tax base collapsed, the city could not maintain its infrastructure. When the infrastructure collapsed, the remaining residents who could afford to leave left. When they left, the tax base collapsed further. This is the death spiral. Economists have a term for it. They call it a negative feedback loop. I call it what it is, a city eating itself alive. And Gary is not unique. Gary is just the most visible example. Gary is what happens when you build an entire city around a single industry and then let that industry walk away without consequence. Let me take you to the next body on the table, Youngstown, Ohio. And I want to tell you about a specific date because the death of Youngstown can be traced to a single day. September 19th, 1977. A Monday. On that Monday, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company announced the closure of its Campbell Works facility. 5,000 workers lost their jobs in a single announcement. 5,000. In a city of 140,000 people, That is the equivalent of New York City losing 350,000 jobs in one afternoon. The event became known as Black Monday. But Black Monday was not the end. It was the beginning. Because after Sheet and Tube closed, the other steel companies looked at the numbers, looked at the foreign competition, looked at the cost of maintaining aging mills, and they made the same calculation. US Steel closed its Youngstown operations. Republic Steel followed. By 1985, Youngstown had lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs. 40,000 in 8 years. A man named James Trafficant, who would later become a congressman and later still go to federal prison, stood on the steps of the Youngstown City Hall in 1980 and said something that I think about every time I look at Rust Belt data. He said, "They did not just take the jobs, they took the reason these people wake up in the morning." And he was right. Because what happened in Youngstown after the mills closed was not just an economic decline, it was an identity collapse. These were families where the great-grandfather worked at Sheet and Tube, the grandfather worked at Sheet and Tube, the father worked at Sheet and Tube, and the son was supposed to work at Sheet and Tube. 4 generations. That was not just employment, that was who you were. That was your family's story, your neighborhood's story, your city's story. And when it ended, people did not just lose paychecks, they lost the plot of their lives. Today, the population of Youngstown is roughly 60,000. It has lost more than half its people since 1970. The median household income is $29,000 a year. For context, the national median is $75,000. Youngstown residents earn less than 40% of what the average American earns. The poverty rate is over 37%. More than 1 in 3 people in Youngstown lives below the poverty line. And here is the detail that keeps me awake at night. The city has torn down more than 5,000 abandoned structures since 2000. 5,000 buildings demolished. And there are still over 3,000 more on the demolition waiting list. They cannot tear them down fast enough. The decay outpaces the demolition crew. Think about that. The city's primary construction activity is not building anything. It is tearing things down. Now we go north, Flint, Michigan. And I know what you are thinking. You are thinking about the water. Everyone thinks about the water. And yes, we are going to talk about the water because you cannot talk about Flint without talking about the water. Flint's population dropped from nearly 200,000 to under 100,000. The city's budget collapsed. Services were cut. Police were cut. Fire departments were cut. Road maintenance was cut. And then, in 2014, in an attempt to save money, the city switched its water supply from the Detroit water system to the Flint River. The Flint River water was corrosive. It ate through the lead pipes that carried water to homes throughout the city. Lead leached into the drinking water. For 18 months, the residents of Flint, Michigan, drank lead-contaminated water. Children drank it. Babies bathed in it. And when residents complained that the water was brown, that it smelled, that it tasted wrong, the state officials told them it was fine. It was safe. There was nothing to worry about. 12 people died from Legionnaire's disease linked to the water. Detroit, Michigan. And I need to be careful here because Detroit is complicated. Detroit is not just a Rust Belt story. Detroit is a race story, a corruption story, a policy story, and an automotive story all wrapped into one. But the core, the engine of everything that went wrong, was the same force that destroyed Gary and Youngstown and Flint. The disappearance of manufacturing. In 1950, Detroit had a population of 1.8 million people. It was the 5th largest city in America. The automotive industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers directly and hundreds of thousands more indirectly. The city was so wealthy that it built the most extensive freeway system in the country. Ironic in retrospect, because those freeways became the escape routes that the middle class used to flee to the suburbs. By 2010, Detroit's population had fallen to 713,000. By 2020, it was 639,000. That is a loss of over 1 million people. More than 60% of the city's population gone. And on July 18, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. $18.5 billion in debt. Let me put that in context. The city owed more money than the entire annual budget of some countries. The bankruptcy filing was handled by an emergency manager named Kevin Orr, who was appointed by the state of Michigan because the city's elected government was deemed incapable of managing its own finances. Democracy effectively was suspended in Detroit. An unelected official made decisions about pensions, services, and debt that affected hundreds of thousands of people who never voted for him. The bankruptcy restructuring resulted in cuts to city worker pensions. People who had worked for the city of Detroit for 20, 30, 40 years saw their retirement income reduced. The Detroit Institute of Arts, one of the finest art museums in the country, nearly had its collections sold off to pay creditors. The city's streetlights were turned off in entire neighborhoods because there was not enough money to maintain them. At one point, an estimated 40% of Detroit's streetlights were not functioning. Imagine that. Imagine living in a major American city where 4 out of 10 streetlights are dark, where you drive down a residential street at night and it looks like a blackout that never ended. That was Detroit. That is Detroit. But here is where the Detroit story gets really interesting and really relevant to what ReportSTATE does. Because Detroit is the city that everyone points to as the comeback kid, the revival city, the Renaissance. And yes, parts of Detroit have come back. The downtown core, maybe 7 square miles out of a total of 139, has seen significant investment. Dan Gilbert, the founder of Quicken Loans, has purchased and renovated over 100 buildings in the downtown area. There are new restaurants, new apartment buildings, new offices. The population of downtown Detroit has increased, but downtown Detroit is not Detroit. Downtown Detroit is a theme park for young professionals, built in the center of a wasteland. Drive 10 minutes in any direction from the Renaissance Center, and you will find neighborhoods that look exactly the same as they did in 2010. Abandoned houses, empty lots where houses used to be, streets with no businesses, no services, no functioning infrastructure. The median household income in Detroit is $34,000. The poverty rate is over 33%. The so-called revival has benefited a small geographic area and a narrow demographic slice. For the majority of Detroiters, nothing has changed. The factories are still gone. The jobs are still gone. The tax base is still broken. The schools are still underfunded. And the people who cannot afford to live in the shiny new downtown apartments are still stuck in the same neighborhoods that have been decaying for 50 years. Now I want to talk about something that most people covering the Rust Belt completely ignore. Something that might be the most important factor in understanding why these places cannot recover. It is called the brain drain, and the numbers are devastating. When a factory closes and a town begins to decline, the first people to leave are the ones with options. The young, the educated, the ambitious, the ones who can get a job somewhere else. They pack up and they go to Columbus, to Chicago, to Nashville, to Denver, to Austin. They go anywhere that has a functioning economy and opportunity, and they do not come back. The US Census data tells this story in excruciating detail. In the state of West Virginia, the population has declined from 1.9 million in 1950 to 1.8 million today. That does not sound dramatic until you realize that the national population more than doubled in that same period. West Virginia did not just fail to grow, it shrank while everything around it expanded, and the people who left were disproportionately young and educated. A researcher named Jim Russell, who studies migration patterns, which is exactly what you find in every Rust Belt city today. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates how this works on the ground. A woman named Patricia Klein, a third-generation steelworker's daughter from Weirton, West Virginia. Her grandfather worked at Weirton Steel. Her father worked at Weirton Steel. She graduated from Weirton High School in 1998, top 10% of her class. She applied to West Virginia University, got in, studied engineering, graduated with honors, and moved to Pittsburgh. Not because she did not love Weirton, because Weirton had nothing for an engineer to do. Weirton Steel had already begun its decline. By 2003, the company filed for bankruptcy. By 2004, it was acquired by a foreign buyer. By 2016, the mill was operating at a fraction of its former capacity, with a fraction of its former workforce. Patricia Klein became a structural engineer in Pittsburgh. She makes a good living. She has a family. She goes back to Weirton for Thanksgiving. And every time she goes back, he wrote that the most effective policy for declining cities may not be revitalization, but rather managed decline, helping people leave and concentrating remaining services in a smaller footprint. In other words, the most humane thing to do for people trapped in dying Rust Belt cities might be to help them get out, not to build a new business park that will sit empty, not to offer tax breaks to a company that will take the money and leave in 5 years, but to help actual human beings relocate to places where they can build lives.